this question and the discussion that follows it is one of the most divisive topics in this game's fanbase. You have the get good stance on one side, brandishing their +10 Zweihander in one hand and a giant middle finger in the other, and the opposing side wants the game to be further open to people that bailed out early because of its debilitatingly high learning curve and didn't really get to appreciate the game's hidden lore and environment design, two of the game's arguably greatest qualities that I think play a really integral part in making Dark Souls what it is. This video isn't going to say whether or not it will get an established easy mode with its remaster, but as a lifelong fan of action RPGs that go past Dark Souls, I want to offer insight on the debate of whether or not it would work, or for that matter, should even be attempted, which is something I have very little opinion on, but think of it from the developer's perspective, for instance. Obviously, a separate mode that's friendlier to newcomers would mean a wider audience range, resulting in more revenue and better results for the company, which would then possibly result in you being able to enjoy better Dark Souls and Bloodborne content because of how much resources they're getting from all the new sales. Or, you know, at least on paper, that's how it would work. What I'm thinking here is an easy mode could definitely work, but there would be more about the game, especially if we're talking PvP, that would probably need an adjustment or two if an easier mode was ever considered. I want you to take a minute and really think about what you personally think an easy mode, air quotes, in Dark Souls would look like. What facets of the game would you change? What in Dark Souls would be pared down to make it easier? Is it really just as simple as, I don't know, lessening the amount of damage you receive on a hit and then calling that an easy mode? Or is it something more convoluted like changing the enemy AI and slowing their movement to where things are easier to predict? Or maybe messing with the item drop rate so enemies drop better equipment more often? Or you could go way the hell back and do what Capcom did in Devil May Cry 1 and just have certain enemies that don't even appear in the easier modes. What about, say, buffing the Estus Flask? What about lessening the requirement to use certain weapons and spells? What about bonfire placement? This is probably going to sound more abrasive than I mean for it to, but this is a question for people on either side of this coin here. When you're debating this with people and you say the words easy mode pertaining to Dark Souls, do you really know what the hell you're even talking about? And now we're getting to the reason why having this debate is so stressful for people. When you say the words easy mode, everyone has a slightly different representation of what they think that means. The words easy mode for Dark Souls generates a different image in everyone else's head, and because no one is taking that into consideration, no one even knows what a hypothetical easy mode in Dark Souls would actually look like. And depending on what side of the debate you're on, what comes from that is either a misguided hatred towards anything outside the normal game, or a complete lack of sympathy for how the developers intended the game be played and experienced. Stir all that up into a nice hot cauldron and out pops one of the most controversial, divisive topics of discussion in the entire community. Now, I already know what everyone's thinking. For PvP, this would be extremely difficult because what if someone invades or someone summons a phantom to help them out and they're playing on two completely different difficulty settings? It's actually a pretty good question, but believe it or not, it has a really easy fix. In fact, this problem has already been solved. Bandai Namco already knows how to tackle this roadblock. What evidence do I have to say that? Well, what happens to you when the server catches you modding your own copy of the game, but not in a way that gives you any distinguishable edge over PvP fights? Well, you get slapped with something called a soft ban. Now, what does this do? You're only allowed to play with and against people who have been given that same status. That's literally your solution right there. What happens if you pick the easy mode? Well, the online servers can be coded perhaps to detect that decision and then only match you up in universes with other players that have enabled that same mode. There's no critical thinking involved in this at all. If they wanted to make a less challenging mode that's also PvP friendly, they've already got the ideal solution right in their hands. There really is no straightforward answer to this question. The benefits of integrating, let's just say, an alternate playing mode instead of just flat out calling it an easier mode are definitely more noticeable on the developer's side of the screen. A friendlier game means a wider fan base, which, as I said before, ultimately results in more revenue and more resources they have available to plug into their next project. If From Software ever decided to develop an easier mode, I can totally imagine them pulling a complete Ninja Gaiden and maybe just naming the mode something disparaging like Pacifier Mode or something. Just as a nice reminder to keep in your head that though just as playable and exciting, you still aren't experiencing the game in its completeness. And here's something else you might want to think about. If FromSoft is willing to throw you the easy mode bone, then what's to say they wouldn't adversely include harder, more challenging modes tailored more towards the veterans of the series? It's a nice thought. Now, I'm 95% sure neither of those two things are happening, and if they were, I'd be willing to stake the entire Superforge name on the assumption that they certainly aren't being included in the remaster. But I wouldn't be against the decision if FromSoft suddenly decided, hey, we're going to bring new game modes to Dark Souls later on. And to the players against the concept of an easier or harder mode, I want to ask, what do you really think makes Dark Souls that hard for some gamers? Because to a lot of people, it apparently really isn't. It's just different. Dark Souls isn't hard, it's just different. You hear people say that all the time. Dark Souls may appear challenging on the surface, but once you acquire the muscle memory, so to speak, the enemy attacks, animations, and projectile physics all become really predictable. It's the only game I can think of playing where you can spend your first playthrough dying every 30 seconds to something you didn't see coming, and the very next playthrough practicing a no-death run, because by then, the surprises that came with your first playthrough are just no longer effective. You're now completely aware of the enemy positions, how they attack, and how and when to follow up with your own offense. It's a game that's hard because it's different, and once you've realized it can't be played like your average hack and slash, your expectations are no longer challenged, and by the second or third playthrough, that game becomes your bitch. So, back to my question. If the game, according to plenty who have played it, isn't that hard, just different, then what's the problem with, say, developing an alternate mode that's not really easier, but different, in the same manner that the vanilla difficulty of Dark Souls is different? And also, bear in mind, there are a lot of people that could very well conquer the tribulations Dark Souls offers, but face it, a lot of these people have jobs. Maybe they're in class studying for an exam or figuring out how to pay bills or something. It's less about not being able to just alpha up on the game and get good, as the kids say it, and more a matter of just not having the resources to put a 100+ hour long commitment into a single game, which really sucks because Dark Souls is totally worth that amount of time. One thing I really would like to see soon is for them to develop an additional mode that's friendlier to the Dark Souls narrative. Not necessarily easy or harder, so to speak. I would just call this lore mode. You spend less time fighting enemies and less time worrying about getting ganked by something stupid, and more time reading better descriptions of equipment, locations. Maybe the mode could come with some sort of bestiary type menu that lets you see interesting facts about the enemies and the bosses you've killed. Hell, if there's one game I can think of that would benefit from something like that, it's probably Dark Souls. The combat system and the amount of health, damage, or whatever wouldn't really have to change, but there could be less traps and unforeseeable occurrences and such, in lieu of additional plot information and backstory that the vanilla game just didn't give you. Now, I know there's a couple holes in that idea, but once again, we're just spitballing here. But anyways, that's irrelevant. The meat of this argument is that the question of whether or not Dark Souls should get an easy mode in the future is lacking some critical information that's kinda required to make that decision. Instead, we should be asking something like, if a mode such as this were to come to fruition, what the hell would it even look like? Because we really don't know. There are so many variables that go into the mechanics of playing this game that an easier experience probably wouldn't look something as simple as making your character stronger. Because no matter how strong you are, no matter the stats you have, grasping the mechanics of dodging and learning how to play around your adversity is much more important. And just for the sake of making a personal prediction, I'd say an easier mode for Souls games is probably pretty far out of the question. However, Dark Souls is a game of understanding mechanics, when to disengage, when to defend, and when it's safe to just go balls out beast mode and sink a shit ton of damage into something. And when it comes to teaching these mechanics to newer players, it would be pretty hard to ignore the benefits of an alternate mode designed to make understanding these concepts a little less tedious. I'm thinking something akin to a training mode you see in a lot of fighting games, but again, that's probably too far of a stretch. Before we start taking sides on such a divisive debate, I think it's really important to just kind of center ourselves a little bit and think about how different playing modes would even work, let alone why it should or shouldn't happen. There's a particular rush that comes with defeating a boss that was giving you so much trouble, and overcoming such incredible adversity. But if we want other players to experience that, the answer might be more complicated than just grabbing a sword and going to work. Thanks for tuning into The Forge. Please consider subscribing and ringing the bell so you catch all of my updates and never miss a video again. Also, please let me know your opinions on this and tell me what you think an easy mode Dark Souls would consist of. What do you think would change? In the meantime, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.